Blog Talk Radio.
Namaste. Welcome one and all to another episode of Hindu Radio, Breaking the Sound Barrier. My name is Tulsi Devi, and I'll be conducting a very special interview with Sri Dharma Pravartaka Acharya, in which he'll be providing a comparison between Sanatana Dharma and Buddhism. Sri Acharya is an American of Italian and Spanish descent who began practicing yoga, meditation, and Sanatana Dharma over 3 decades ago. He is currently recognized by the global Hindu community as one of the most highly authentic and qualified Dharma and Vedanta gurus in the world today. His website is one of the largest and most informative websites on Sanatana Dharma in the world, dharmacentral.com. Welcome, Sri Acharya, to the Hindu Radio program. Our last 2 interviews with you were among our most popular shows. It's our honor to have you on the show again today.
Namaste, Tulsi. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be on again. This has been a truly wonderful experience the previous times that I've been on the show, and I'm looking forward to the interview today.
Sanatana Dharma and Buddhism have both become very popular in the West in recent decades. Since the two are so similar, many people often confuse the two as being the same path. Are they?
Well, that is actually a very popular question, because it is true that in the West especially, both Vedic spirituality or Sanatana Dharma, but also Buddhism have definitely become very, very popular in the last few decades. Thinking about Buddhism specifically, of course, the Dalai Lama is to a very great extent responsible for the popularity and the growth of Buddhism all throughout the Western world, America and Europe, literally throughout the entire world. And as a result, again, this does tend to be a very popular question that people ask me. What specifically is the relationship between Sanatana Dharma and Buddhism? While it's a very popular question, as we'll see, it is also a very complicated question. The answer to this is not quite as straightforward as people would think. And let me just begin by saying this, that as they exist today as 2 separate paths, certainly they are not the same. Certainly Sanatana Dharma and Buddhism are indeed 2 different religions. However, historically, at one time, specifically at the time of the Buddha, they were indeed one path. They were indeed the same, but that is no longer the case anymore.
Can you please tell us a bit about the origin of Buddhism, as well as the similarities between Vedic spirituality and Buddhism?
Well, there's a lot to be said about this, and this again deals with what I was just saying, how originally the 2 were indeed one path. But I'll try to talk about this in as brief a way as I can, because again, there is a lot to say. First of all, Gautama Buddha himself, of course, as I think many people know, himself was actually a Hindu. He himself was actually a follower of Vedic spirituality, of Vedic culture. He was born, quote-unquote, Hindu. He lived a Hindu lifestyle all of his life, and he was Hindu until the moment that he passed away. And during his life, at no time did he ever claim to be revealing some sort of new revelation, new religion, or starting a new sect. Rather, in his mind, and again, we know this historically through the literature, through the teachings, in his mind, what he was doing was teaching a pure form of Dharma, a pure form of natural way. Another thing that's interesting about the Buddha that unfortunately many people tend to forget, because of course it being 2,500 years since the life of the Buddha, he's become a very venerated figure, but people tend to forget the fact that the Buddha himself was in fact a yogi. He's someone who practiced yoga all of his life, and he is somebody who achieved perfection in yoga. And in fact, not only was he a yogi, but if you look at his actual teachings, the core teachings, the original teachings, especially as you find them in the original Pali literature, which is the oldest extant literature that we have, that contain the teachings of the Buddha, what you find is that many of his teachings are, in fact, very similar to what you would find in the Upanishads. Well, I just want to talk a little bit, again, very briefly, about the life of the Buddha, because it's truly an amazing story. And for those who know the life story already, of course, I'll be, again, leaving a lot out just to make this very brief, because I know we only have half an hour. But again, the Buddha himself was actually born and raised as a Hindu prince. He was living in extreme luxury as a result of his father hearing the prophecy that his son would possibly become a sage and leave the kingdom. And after some time, the Buddha essentially wanted to know what was the meaning of life. He left. Again, he became a yogi for a period of 5 to 6 years, living in the forest, practicing tremendous penances, meditation, yoga, etc. And eventually, to make a long story short, he did, in time, after about 5 or 6 years, achieve what is called nirvana. He achieved essentially self-realization. He achieved enlightenment. What is a beautiful story about the Buddha is that when this occurred, when he achieved enlightenment and he left his sitting place for the first time and re-emerged in the public, the first people who saw him were just absolutely amazed by him. And it's not surprising, when a person becomes a sage, they have a glow about them. They have this aura, this truly magnificent presence to them. And the people who encountered him were just amazed by this. And they began asking him these questions. Sir, who are you? Are you a god? What are you? And his answer to these questions became legendary. Essentially, he said in pure Sanskrit, Aham Buddhasmi. He said, I am awake. I am awake. Just a truly beautiful answer. So that's the origin of Buddhism. Let me talk a little bit about the similarities in the teachings between Sanatana Dharma and what the Buddha actually taught. And I'll just go through a very quick list here. First of all, of course, both stress the concept of Dharma. Both stress the idea that when we look at the universe around us, we can discern natural laws that are there in the universe, and that the way that we achieve happiness, both materially but also spiritually, is by living in accordance with that natural law, that Dharma. So again, that's one thing that both traditions have in common. The other thing is a very firm belief in karma and reincarnation. Both Sanatana Dharma and Buddhism believe that we reincarnate in accordance with our specific karma. Also, there is a belief in the idea of devas and asuras. In other words, in the idea that there are gods, or what some people would call demigods, very powerful beings in the universe. But then conversely, there are also demonic beings, known as asuras as well, who we're meant to avoid. Another thing that they have in common is the concept of triloka, or the idea that there are 3 planes of existence within the material world. That is the earthly plane that we're on, the heavenly plane, what is sometimes called svarga, and then the hellish plane. And that the goal of life is indeed to transcend all 3 of these planes. Another thing that both Vedic spirituality and Buddhism have in common are the idea of ethical principles, of dharmic ethical principles. The idea that in everything that we do, we should try to be moral beings. In keeping with that, ahimsa, or the idea of nonviolence, is also very important to both Sanatana Dharma and Buddhism, as well as vegetarianism. And in fact, one thing that the Buddha strived to achieve when he was here and when he was teaching among us is that he wanted to try to bring Sanatana Dharma back to the idea of vegetarianism, because at that time, again, roughly 2,500 years ago, many people had actually abandoned vegetarianism. So that's an important practice in both traditions. Meditation certainly is something that you find both in Buddhism as well as Sanatana Dharma, as well as yoga, puja, or ritual worship. You find homa, or what sometimes is called yagya, the idea of fire ritual. In fact, this is still a very prevalent practice, for example, in Tibetan Buddhism. And then philosophically, the Buddhist, what is sometimes called the Buddhist idea of pratitya samutpada, That is the idea of dependent origination, that everything in existence really has its causality based upon other things in existence. This is an idea, interestingly, that is not only quote-unquote Buddhist, but that Vedic spirituality also completely agrees with, as well as this other idea of what is called anitya in Sanskrit, the idea of impermanence. You know, the word nitya in Sanskrit means that which is permanent or eternal. Anitya means impermanence. So in other words, the idea that everything that we see around us is temporary. That's something which, again, both traditions very much share. And these are just a few of what are actually hundreds and hundreds of similarities between the two traditions.
So the Buddha was a follower of Vedic culture. Why then is the Buddhism of today so different from the original teachings of the Buddha?
Okay, well, this is a very good question, and this gets really to the core of the issue. You know, it's very interesting. When we look at Buddhism as it exists today in contemporary times, we need to understand that historically there is indeed a difference between Buddha himself and what he taught versus the institution of what we today call Buddhism. And the two are not necessarily synonymous. You know, many people recognize this dichotomy, for example, when it comes to Christianity. There are many more intelligent spiritual people who, for example, understand that Jesus and the institution of Christianity are not synonymous, that they're two very separate things. Well, the same can be said about what the Buddha originally taught, what he originally did, who he originally was, versus 2,500 years of institutional development and what we today call Buddhism. It's as a result of not quite having this understanding of this distinction that many Americans, many Europeans, individuals who find themselves attracted to Buddhism, unfortunately tend to do so without a full understanding of the philosophical content of Buddhism and the philosophical implications of Buddhism. Let's go a little bit deeper into this, first looking at the history. Again, originally, what the Buddha taught was something very, very different, and we'll go into that a little bit more somewhat later, because at first I just want to talk about the history for right now. What we see that actually occurred was several hundred years after the Buddha, there were several councils that took place. These were councils that were essentially designed to try to codify the teachings of the Buddha and to try to, again, create some sort of institution. Now, the most significant of these councils was the Third Council, and this was done under the famous king Ashoka. This happened roughly 250 BC or so. What we find is that Ashoka institutionalized Buddhism in such a way that essentially he took what were many, many, many different Buddhist schools of thought and essentially forced them into a cookie-cutter type of organization, where basically he established the institution of what later became Buddhism. This is the first thing that essentially changed the Buddha's teachings into what we have now. The second was a very important philosopher. His name was Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna lived roughly 150 to 250 AD. No one knows exactly when, but those are the rough dates. Nagarjuna also somewhat altered the teachings of the Buddha from what it was originally to then introducing the concept of what's called shunyata, or nothingness. And again, I'll talk a little bit more in depth about the actual philosophical content of Nagarjuna in a short time. If I were to make, again, a comparison between the original teachings of the Buddha versus what occurred after these two individuals, Ashoka, who, again, rigidly institutionalized Buddhism, and then Nagarjuna, who introduced philosophical concepts that were not there originally. It's very similar, again, to what we find with the original teachings and actions and person of Jesus versus, let's say, what is sometimes called Pauline Christianity, or the Christianity of Paul. You know, many people in the Christian context have made this observation, that when you look at Christianity, you really have two Christianities. You have the Christianity of the Gospels, which are the original teachings of Jesus, but then you have the Christianity of Paul, which is much more rigid, much more theologically oriented, and which has a completely different and much more fundamentalist sort of emphasis. Well, again, the parallel is very similar. The same thing happened essentially, historically, with Buddhism and the teachings of the Buddha.
It does sound like the changes made to the Buddha's original teachings were similar to the distortions to the original teachings of Jesus that eventually occurred in Christianity.
Yes, again, the parallel is just truly amazing. And interestingly, you find this historically again and again. You know, what you find is that a great teacher comes upon the scene. The teacher has their own mystical, subjective experience of the divine. The followers have, for the most part, only a glimpse of that. They're trying to understand it, and then suddenly the teacher leaves. And what ends up happening is within a few generations, sometimes it's very brief, sometimes it's one generation, as in the case of Jesus. But what happens is within a few generations at the most, the pure teachings of that teacher become codified. They become concretized. They become institutionalized. And in many cases, they even become changed in many, many different ways. So again, you find this not only in Christianity, but even though it may be a surprise to many people who know Buddhism or follow Buddhism, the same thing really did happen with Buddhism. In fact, again, the parallels are just truly amazing. In the same way that Constantine institutionalized and forced rigidity upon Christianity, Ashoka did the exact same thing. And interestingly, they were both kings, they were both emperors actually, who converted to this new path. But again, their reaction, being kings, being of course authoritarian, their reaction to what it means to follow this path is, well, this is not organized enough, let me organize it in accordance with my perspective. And then again, the parallel between Paul in Christianity and Nagarjuna in Buddhism also is very striking. And the idea of how both of them essentially altered, changed the theology, the philosophy of the original teachings.
What is it that contemporary institutional Buddhism teaches?
When we are talking about Buddhism as it exists today, and again, in contradistinction to the original teachings of the Buddha, what we find is that there are many concepts within contemporary Buddhism which, interestingly, many individuals in the West especially who follow Buddhism really would not agree with if they actually even knew what these teachings were, and in many cases, many of them don't. And for those who do know what these teachings are, many of them just kind of follow Buddhism despite that, and they themselves choose not to believe these things. And let me explain what some of these things are. Contemporary Buddhism, for example, teaches a misinterpretation of the idea of what is called anatman. Anatman means essentially no self. That's the literal translation of this word. Now, the Buddha himself did indeed teach this idea. However, the way it's misunderstood today has completely altered the original teachings of the Buddha. Originally, what the Buddha meant by there not being a self is that there is not a material self. There is not a self that is comprised of temporal material objects. There is not a self that is the body, that is the mind, that is the intellect, etc. However, he did indeed believe that there was a transcendent and eternal self. How do we know this? Because he does indeed use the word Atman. He does use the word Atman in the original literature. I have read it myself. Many scholars of Buddhism are very much aware of this and will very readily agree with this. He does indeed talk about the doctrine of Atman, and that is the word that he uses. He does teach that there is an eternal self. However, again, misinterpreting this concept of Anatman, which originally taught that there is no material self, contemporary Buddhism has conflated this to the point where they now believe that there is literally no self, that there is no eternal being, there is no soul. And again, this is not what the Buddha originally taught. In addition, contemporary Buddhism is also atheistic. And again, this is not open to contention. You know, the Dalai Lama himself very proudly has spoken about this. And, you know, we can approach any Buddhist monk or scholar or authority and ask them, well, do you believe in a God? And, of course, they will absolutely say no. No, we do not believe in a God. They are completely atheistic. Another contemporary belief of today's Buddhism is, again, the idea of shunyavada or shunyata, which was originally created by Nagarjuna. Shunya in Sanskrit means nothing or nothingness. The idea, and again, I'm stating this in as small a nutshell as can be done in the time frame that we have. The idea of shunyata is this, that essentially everything in existence that is either conceivable or perceivable ultimately can be broken down to show its impermanence, and thus what the absolute consists of is indeed nothingness. This is the teaching of Nagarjuna, which was then developed by many other philosophers. But again, Nagarjuna lived rather recently in comparison with the Buddha. He lived basically in the first century A.D., whereas the Buddha existed 600 years before him. And we know that this was not the original teaching of the Buddha, the idea of nothingness or nihilism. Now, there are several other problems that we find with contemporary Buddhism. Again, this alteration of the original teachings of the Buddha. In addition to what I mentioned previously, there is no transcendent permanence. Therefore, there is no transcendent basis for reality. So this poses a problem because without a basis for reality, essentially, there is no philosophical or spiritual task that we are capable of achieving. That's one problem. Another problem is in contemporary Buddhist epistemology. The idea of Buddhist epistemology is not only a rejection of the Vedas and a rejection of the idea of transcendent knowledge and even the possibility of the existence of transcendent knowledge, but more, Buddhist epistemology is based upon the idea that the only things that we can know is what is knowable to the senses and what is knowable to the mind. Well, this sounds fine except for this problem. We are not the senses and we are not the mind, according to even Buddhism itself. So therefore, we are really capable of knowing nothing. And being capable of knowing nothing, well, we can't know truth. We can't know nirvana. And then finally, this is what ends up being the greatest conundrum in, again, contemporary Buddhism, not the original teachings of the Buddha. We always have to make that distinction. One of the greatest problems is this. Contemporary Buddhism teaches that there is no self. there literally is no self. The idea that there even is a self, that there is a permanent existent being, what we would call a soul, within the person, this idea is itself an illusion, according to Buddhism. Now, this is the problem. On the one hand, Buddhism says there is no self. On the other hand, we have a task that was given to us by the Buddha himself. And what is that task? To transcend suffering by achieving nirvana. Now, this is the problem. If there is no self to become liberated, if there is no self who is experiencing suffering, and more, if there is no self to achieve nirvana and thus to experience the cessation of suffering and the bliss of nirvana, then what is the purpose of achieving the bliss of nirvana? You see how the entire undergirding of this philosophical system is completely destroyed if we understand this. So what we find is that, again, with contemporary Buddhism that was developed many, many, many hundreds of years after the Buddha's life, what we find is that there are many problems, conundrums, philosophical confusions that simply cannot be reconciled in any way.
How are we to understand contemporary Buddhist philosophy compared to Vedic philosophy?
First of all, again, it is very important to understand what the Buddha's original teachings actually were. And when we look at the actual teachings of the Buddha, again, we see that they are much more in concert with Vedic spirituality than many people would have believed. That's the first thing. The other thing is to understand specifically what are his teachings about the existence of the self. Again, he uses the term Atman. He talks about Atman in a very positive way. He explains in several passages that the goal is indeed to know the self, and in the original, that word is Atman. We also find in very early Buddhism another important concept, and that is the idea of what's called Tathagata Garbha. Very, very long word, but essentially this is another word that's used in early Buddhist philosophical literature to refer to the idea that indeed there is a self, there is an eternal self. Now, before we run out of time, there is one thing that I do want to discuss very quickly when it comes to understanding the teachings of contemporary Buddhism vis-a-vis Sanatana Dharma. You know, the teachings of Buddhism form what I call in Latin a via negativa. In other words, they do indeed teach the truth. I mean, this is something that needs to be stressed. In no way am I trying to say that Buddhism is devoid of value. No, on the contrary, it has tremendous value. However, again, as a via negativa, it tells us what reality is not. And in a way, this was really what the Buddha was aiming at. What the teachings of Buddhism and the Buddha teach us is that we are not the body, we are not anything that is impermanent. However, unfortunately, Buddhism stops there. It tells us what we are not, but it doesn't then take that extra step to tell us positively what we are. It offers us a via negativa, a negative path, a path of negation, but it doesn't offer us a via positiva, a positive path that tells us positively what is the nature of our eternal being. What we need to do in order to discover this is turn to Vedanta. And it's in Vedanta that we then discover positively what is the nature of Atman. Not merely that we are Atman, but what is the nature of that true self.
How do we reconcile the original teachings of the Buddha with our yearning for God and a meaningful realization of our eternal soul?
Again, in Buddhism, what we find is that Sanatana Dharma itself teaches that the Buddha himself was actually an avatar, was actually an incarnation of the divine, sent here to teach us. So what we find is that, again, the original idea of the Buddha and his teachings are very much in concert with Sanatana Dharma. And if anything, one could say that Sanatana Dharma itself is actually pure Buddha Dharma.
Sri Acharya, on behalf of Vrindavan Parker and the Hindu radio program, I want to thank you enormously for taking time out of your very demanding schedule to share some of your wisdom and insights with us.
It has been my pleasure, and thank you Vrindavan Parker in India, for arranging this. Namaste.
Namaste. Once again, for any of our listeners who are interested in learning more about this amazing spiritual teacher and to support the crucial work he is doing to serve the Dharma community, please visit his website, dharmacentral.com.